Finally forced out. The former Prince, now Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, has officially left Royal Lodge and will live in a home on Sandringham Estate in Norfolk. It comes as his brother speaks out on the Epstein scandal.
Forced out. That's the only way to describe what just happened behind the gates of Royal Lodge. King Charles has done something no modern monarch has ever done to a sibling. He pushed his own brother out of a 30-room mansion Andrew called home for over 20 years. But here's the question nobody is asking loudly enough. Forcing Andrew out was the easy part. What happens now? What Andrew does next? Where he goes? What he says? Who he talks to? That's the part that could actually destroy the crown. Are you ready to understand why? Because by the end of this video, you'll see this isn't a story about a house. It's a story about a ticking clock the royal family cannot stop. Picture it. Early morning. Grey Windsor sky. A convoy of vans lined up outside a set of gates that have guarded royal history for more than 2 centuries. A man who was once His Royal Highness carries his own boxes now. Photographs in cheap frames, files stuffed into cardboard, a life packed away by hand because there's no longer a household staff to do it for him. Police stand nearby, not to protect him from the public, but seemingly to make sure he actually leaves. This is Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. Not Prince Andrew. Not the Duke of York. Just Andrew. And the gates of Royal Lodge, the same gates that watched Queen Elizabeth grow up, that Princess Margaret ran past as a little girl, are closing behind him for the very last time. Ask yourself something honestly. If you'd spent 23 years believing a piece of paper protected you, a legal lease, signed and sealed, running decades into the future, how would you feel watching that protection dissolve in a single palace statement? That's not a hypothetical for Andrew. That's the exact position he found himself in. And the strange part is, this story didn't start with a scandal headline or a courtroom. It started with something as mundane as a housing arrangement, and it grew, piece by piece, into arguably the most consequential family crisis the modern British monarchy has ever managed.
Two nations and our own peoples spans not merely 250 years, but over 4 centuries. It is extraordinary to think that I am the 19th in our line of sovereigns to study with daily...
If you're new here, you need to understand something before we go any further. This isn't just a story about eviction. This is a story about a king choosing, in real time, between protecting his brother and protecting the institution he was born to lead. And the decision he made has consequences nobody, not Charles, not Andrew, maybe not even the palace's own advisors, can fully predict. So stay with me through this one, because the ending of this story hasn't been written yet, and what comes in the final chapter might be the most important part of all. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe now, because you do not want to miss what we uncover next. Let's go back. Because to understand how staggering this fall actually is, you need to understand what Andrew had. Not just a house. An empire of privilege, built over 2 decades, that seemed, for the longest time, completely untouchable. Think about this for a second. What would it feel like to live in a 30-room Georgian mansion, tucked inside one of the most protected and prestigious pieces of land in the entire United Kingdom? For most people, that's a fantasy. For Prince Andrew, it was simply Tuesday. Royal Lodge sits inside Windsor Great Park, a Grade 2 listed property with a pedigree most stately homes can only dream of. 7 bedrooms. A sunken garden landscaped over generations. A private chapel for worship away from prying eyes. A swimming pool. An aviary. 6 separate lodge cottages scattered across the grounds, some for staff, some for the protection officers whose job was to keep him safe around the clock. But the real value of Royal Lodge was never just square footage. It was history, breathing through the wall.
Correspondent Mimi Becker is outside the former Royals' former residence, Royal Lodge. Mimi, he snuck out overnight.
Pete, in the cover of darkness on Monday night, the disgraced royal booted out of his 30-room mansion, and he'll now live around a 3-hour drive away at Sandringham Estate in Norfolk. This move has been months in the making since Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was stripped of his titles in October. His new home will be privately funded by the King, and it is still currently under renovation. Pete.
Mimi, thank you.
Queen Elizabeth herself spent part of her childhood inside the house. Princess Margaret grew up chasing her sister through those same corridors. The Queen Mother lived there until the day she died in 2002. When Andrew moved in the following year, in 2003, he wasn't just getting a home, he was stepping into a lineage. And the terms of that deal? Almost impossible to believe. A 75-year lease running all the way to June the 15th, 2078. An upfront payment of £1 million. And then, astonishingly, an annual rent that was essentially symbolic, what's known as peppercorn rent. If you don't know that term, here's what it means. Rent so nominal, so close to nothing, that it exists mostly on paper. Andrew was living, for all practical purposes, rent-free, inside a mansion worth many millions of pounds. It's worth understanding just how unusual this financial arrangement looked to outside eyes once it became widely known. Most people in Britain, if they lease a property anywhere near the scale of a stately home, expect to pay market rent, often substantial sums, adjusted regularly, subject to renegotiation. Andrew's arrangement bypassed almost all of that. The peppercorn rent structure meant that, on paper, he owed almost nothing annually, a legal quirk more commonly associated with symbolic ceremonial leases than with a working royal residence occupied by a senior member of the family. For years, this detail sat largely unnoticed by the wider public, buried in property records rather than headlines. It would take a shift in the national mood, driven by economic hardship rather than royal scandal alone, to bring it into full public view. In 2008, his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson moved in alongside him. A divorced couple, sharing a roof, sharing a life, in an arrangement that raised eyebrows across the country but somehow, for years, just worked.
You've chosen to speak out for the first time. Why have you decided to talk now?
Because there is no good time to talk about Mr. Epstein and all things associated, we've been talking.
Guests who visited Royal Lodge over the years described a household that functioned almost like a private world of its own. Staff moving quietly through corridors, the sunken garden maintained to exacting standards, the sense that whatever chaos existed in the tabloid stayed firmly outside the gates. For 2 decades, this setup felt bulletproof. Andrew had the lease. He had the address. He had the legacy. He believed, quite reasonably at the time, that nothing could take it away from him. Think about how much certainty that kind of arrangement builds into a person's life. When you know, on a legal and practical level, that your home is secured for the next 70 years, you plan differently. You renovate differently. You invest differently, and by most accounts, Andrew did exactly that, pouring money and years into a property he had every reason to believe would outlast him. He was wrong. And the moment that belief started to crack is where this story really begins. Fast forward to a Britain gripped by a brutal cost of living crisis. Families across the country choosing between heating their homes and putting food on the table. And in the middle of that national hardship, the public becomes increasingly aware and increasingly furious that a prince who no longer performs royal duties, a man tied to one of the most damaging scandals in royal history, is living in a multi-million-pound estate for next to nothing. Can you feel that anger? Try to imagine being a taxpayer, watching your bills climb every month, and then learning that arrangement was sitting there the entire time. The backlash wasn't quiet. It wasn't polite. It built and built until it became impossible for the palace to ignore. Behind closed doors, King Charles reportedly spent months trying to persuade his younger brother to simply downsize, to move somewhere smaller, somewhere less politically radioactive. Frogmore Cottage was floated as an option, more modest, less headline-grabbing, more in line with a man no longer representing the crown in public life. But according to people close to the situation, Andrew wasn't interested. He believed his lease protected him. He believed the law was on his side. He believed, right up until it wasn't true anymore, that he simply wasn't going anywhere. And then came the memoir. Virginia Giuffre's book landed in 2024, and it detonated every headline Andrew had spent years trying to bury, reigniting the full weight of his association with Jeffrey Epstein in the public consciousness. The pressure on King Charles didn't just increase. It became, by most accounts, unbearable. The reputation of the crown itself was now on the line. Something had to give. On October the 30th, 2025, it did. Try to picture the scene inside Buckingham Palace that morning. A statement is drafted, measured, formal, but absolutely seismic in what it says. Buckingham Palace announced that His Majesty had initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and honours of Prince Andrew. Sit with that sentence for a second. A reigning monarch, formally stripping his own brother of his royal identity. When was the last time anything like that happened? You'd have to go back to 1917, more than a century. To Prince Charles Edward losing his Duke of Albany title for fighting on Germany's side during the First World War. That was a decision made during a literal world war, when questions of loyalty and enemy allegiance carried existential stakes for the monarchy itself. What's happening now carries none of that wartime backdrop, and yet the institutional weight of the decision is arguably just as heavy. This wasn't a modern precedent. There was no modern precedent. This was history repeating itself in the most uncomfortable way possible, only this time the threat wasn't a foreign war, it was the accumulated damage of scandal, public trust, and years of unresolved tension finally reaching a breaking point. It's worth remembering that titles within the British royal family aren't simply symbolic decorations. They come with constitutional and ceremonial weight, tied to centuries of tradition around succession, precedence, and public representation. Removing them isn't as simple as issuing a press release, it requires formal legal process, coordination between the palace and government bodies, and, in cases like this, an extraordinary level of consensus that the situation genuinely warrants such drastic action. The fact that this process moved forward at all tells you how thoroughly exhausted the alternative options had become. The statement continued, laying out the consequences in unmistakable terms. Andrew would now be known simply as Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. No more His Royal Highness. No more Duke of York. And then, the detail that turned this from symbolic to devastatingly practical, formal notice had been served to surrender the lease on Royal Lodge. He would be required to move to alternative private accommodation. Everything Andrew believed protected him, the 75-year lease, the peppercorn rent, the legal architecture he'd leaned on for over 2 decades, was, in that instant, rendered irrelevant. But here's what made the palace's statement land even harder. It wasn't just about titles and property. The palace explicitly stated that the king and queen wanted it known they cared deeply about the victims and survivors of mistreatment of any kind. Read between the lines and the message is unmistakable. This was the institution publicly aligning itself with Andrew's accusers. Not staying neutral. Not staying quiet. Choosing a side. And it wasn't his. Consider what that means for an institution that has, historically, guarded its neutrality above almost everything else. The monarchy survives, in part, by staying above the fray, by refusing to be pulled into taking public positions on contentious issues. For King Charles to break that pattern, publicly, against his own brother, tells you just how untenable the previous status quo had become. This wasn't a decision made lightly, and it wasn't one made quickly. By most accounts, it was the product of months, if not years, of mounting pressure that finally reached a breaking point the palace could no longer manage quietly. The public reaction to the announcement was immediate. Newspapers around the world ran the story within hours. Commentators debated whether the move went far enough, or whether it was long overdue. And inside the family itself, reports suggested a mixture of relief and tension. Relief that a resolution of sorts had finally been reached, tension over what it might mean for the family's public image going forward, and for how the next generation of royals would be viewed in light of it. If you've made it this far, you already understand how big this story is, and we're only getting started. There's a hoarding discovery behind those walls that stunned even seasoned royal reporters, a new home with a flood risk report attached to its address, and a family decision that might be the most telling detail in this entire saga. Subscribe now if you don't want to miss any of it, because Chapter 4 is where this story stops being about eviction and starts being about something much stranger. Andrew was given 12 months to vacate, a deadline stretching to October 2026. But reporting at the time suggested King Charles privately hoped his brother would be gone far sooner, ideally by Easter 2025. Why the urgency? What was pushing Charles to move so fast on someone who was, after all, his own brother? The fallout didn't stop with Andrew. Sarah Ferguson, who had remained at his side through scandal after scandal, lost her own title, Duchess of York, gone. Friends described her as devastated, reportedly leaning on her daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, for support in the aftermath. The damage was no longer contained to one man. It was spreading through the entire family structure. Beatrice and Eugenie, who had largely managed to build lives and public reputation somewhat separate from their father's scandals, reportedly found themselves once again pulled into a story they hadn't chosen. Both had spent years working to establish their own identities away from the controversy surrounding Andrew through their careers, their marriages, their own young families. Watching both of their parents lose their titles within the same period, according to people close to the family, was described as a genuinely painful moment, regardless of how much distance the sisters had tried to maintain from the underlying scandal itself. Neither daughter has publicly commented in detail on the situation, which royal watchers have interpreted as a deliberate choice to stay out of the spotlight while their parents navigate the fallout. And then there was the money question. Would Andrew be compensated for the years and the millions he'd reportedly poured into renovating Royal Lodge? The Crown Estate launched an assessment to examine the property's condition and work out what, if anything, he might be owed. What they found inside changed the entire tone of this story. As removal vans began arriving at Royal Lodge in late 2025, details started leaking to the press that nobody had anticipated. Multiple sources reportedly used the same word to describe what investigators found: hoarder. Room after room, reportedly stacked high with documents, photographs, and possessions accumulated across decades, belongings crammed into every corner of a 30-room mansion. What should have been a relatively straightforward move apparently turned into something closer to an excavation. One friend was quoted as saying the clutter at Royal Lodge was turning what should have been a simple move into a months-long, room-by-room operation. Another source reportedly went further, suggesting that even if Andrew had wanted to leave immediately, the sheer volume of possessions requiring sorting made that practically impossible. It's worth pausing here, because this detail says something about more than just logistics. Here is a man who stepped back from public royal duties in 2019, who had grown increasingly withdrawn from public life in the years since, and, according to these accounts, had been quietly surrounding himself with physical remnants of a life and status that no longer existed. Whether that reflects something about coping, about identity, about simply refusing to let go. That's speculation, and we should treat it as speculation. But it's hard not to wonder what it says about a man who couldn't seem to release his grip on who he used to be. Reports describing the scale of what was found inside Royal Lodge painted a picture few had anticipated. Rooms that hadn't been properly cleared in years. Furniture and belongings from a working royal life that officially ended back in 2019, still sitting untouched. Photographs spanning decades of engagements, state visits, and family occasions, boxed but never sorted. For a property of this size and significance, the logistics alone, cataloguing everything, deciding what belonged to Andrew personally versus what belonged to the Crown Estate, working out what could be kept, stored, or discarded, turned into a project requiring specialist teams rather than a simple moving crew. The practical consequences were significant. King Charles had reportedly envisioned a relatively fast transition. The hoarding situation appears to have pushed that timeline out considerably, with some reports suggesting the process might drag on until at least Andrew's 66th birthday on February the 19th, 2026, possibly longer. Storage units were arranged to absorb the overflow. Every single room needed to be catalogued, sorted, and cleared by hand. for a palace machine accustomed to careful, choreographed timelines. State visits planned years in advance, ceremonial events rehearsed down to the minute, the unpredictability of clearing out Royal Lodge reportedly proved to be a genuine source of frustration. Plans to formally hand the property back to the Crown Estate, potentially opening it up for future royal or institutional use, kept getting pushed back as the true scale of the clearance work became clear. What was originally expected to be a matter of weeks stretched into months, turning what should have been a relatively contained transition into an ongoing, visible reminder of just how complicated Andrew's departure had become. And then, the final financial blow. According to reporting on the Crown Estate's assessment, Andrew was likely to receive little to no compensation for surrendering his lease early. Despite the original £1 million upfront payment and the reported millions more invested in renovations over the years. The property's condition, the wear, the deterioration, the impact of the hoarding, all of it was said to offset any claim he might otherwise have had. He was losing the house. And by most accounts, he was getting nothing back for it. To understand how significant that is, consider how leasehold compensation typically works. When a long lease is surrendered early, especially one involving substantial improvements made by the leaseholder, some form of financial settlement is usually expected, reflecting the value added to the property during occupancy. That's standard practice across most leasehold arrangements in the UK, royal or otherwise. For the Crown Estate's assessment to conclude that dilapidations and property condition effectively cancelled out any such claim suggests the scale of deterioration and disrepair was considered genuinely severe, not a minor technicality, but a substantive finding that shaped the entire financial outcome. For a man who had, by most accounts, treated Royal Lodge as a lifelong home rather than a temporary residence, walking away with nothing to show for over 2 decades of investment represents a uniquely bitter conclusion to the whole arrangement. Now here's where the story takes its strangest turn yet, because where Andrew ends up next might be more revealing than anything that happened at Royal Lodge. When word got out about Andrew's new address, royal watchers were reportedly stunned. Marsh Farm. A small, largely unused working farm in Wolverton, roughly 2 miles west of Sandringham House. It had sat empty for years following the death of its previous tenant farmer, and those who'd seen the property inside reportedly described it as rundown, in need of serious work just to be considered livable. Let the contrast sink in. From 30 rooms in a Georgian mansion to what friends reportedly called a showbox by comparison. From a private chapel to a property barely large enough for one person. From a swimming pool, an aviary, and a sunken garden to a modest farmhouse requiring extensive renovation before anyone could move in. And here's the detail that reportedly stung the most. Andrew apparently didn't want Marsh Farm at all. What he wanted, according to sources cited at the time, was Wood Farm, Prince Philip's former retirement home. Larger. More comfortable. Closer to Sandringham House itself. But Wood Farm was reportedly ruled out for one specific reason. It would have placed Andrew too close to the rest of the royal family during occasions like Christmas. Think about what that detail actually implies. The 2-mile gap between Marsh Farm and Sandringham House wasn't incidental. According to royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams, keeping Andrew at Sandringham was, in a sense, a way of controlling him, a way of managing his presence without cutting him off from the estate entirely. By January 2026, construction crews were reportedly on site at Marsh Farm, at least 6 workmen working through the rain, installing security upgrades and carrying out repairs. A new 6-foot fence went up in place of old barbed wire. CCTV cameras were installed around the property, tied into a wider surveillance system. The scope of the renovation work reportedly extended well beyond security. Given that the property had sat largely unoccupied since the death of its previous tenant farmer, basic infrastructure needed attention too: plumbing, heating, electrical systems, none of which had been maintained to the standard required for a full-time residence, let alone one housing a former senior royal. Contractors reportedly worked through difficult winter weather conditions to try to meet a moving timeline that kept shifting as new issues were discovered. It's the kind of renovation project that, for an ordinary homeowner, might take the better part of a year to complete properly, compressed here into a matter of weeks, under intense public scrutiny, with security requirements layered on top of standard habitability work. But problems kept surfacing. The property reportedly lacked adequate garaging for Andrew's vehicles, apparently a real source of frustration for him. It also wasn't large enough to support live-in staff, meaning King Charles was reportedly arranging for a cleaner, a groundsman, and a cook to come from Sandringham on an as-needed basis. Pause on that for a moment, because the psychological weight of it is significant. This is a man who has never run his own household. Raised inside Buckingham Palace, surrounded by staff attending to every need since birth. Now, reportedly, dependent on help arriving and leaving according to a schedule set by his brother. One source reportedly summed it up simply: it's a lot smaller and a lot less luxurious than Royal Lodge. Another added that Andrew hadn't lived anywhere that small since he left his apartment at Buckingham Palace, back when he still had free roam of the building and its grounds. There's something almost symbolic about that comparison. His last experience of a modest, self-contained living space was decades ago, before marriage, before fatherhood, before the scandal that would come to define the latter half of his public life. Returning to that scale of living now, in his mid-60s, after everything that's happened in between, is a different kind of experience entirely, not a return to simplicity, but a stark demonstration of just how far his circumstances have fallen. Neighbours in the Wolferton area, largely unfamiliar with royal life at close range, have reportedly found themselves suddenly living alongside heightened security patrols and construction crews, a strange new normal for what was, until recently, a quiet rural corner of the Sandringham estate. If this story is already surprising you, wait until you hear what came next, because the location itself carries a danger nobody expected. Make sure you're subscribed, because what we're about to cover next connects environmental risk, security concerns, and a family decision that might explain everything. In January 2026, a detail emerged that sent a fresh wave of concern through royal circles. Marsh Farm sits on a floodplain. A flood risk assessment covering the nearby Wolferton Barnes area, just meters from Marsh Farm, stated plainly that the Environment Agency operates a flood warning system specifically to help residents protect life and property in the event of flooding. This isn't a hypothetical concern. It's a documented, officially recognized risk. The assessment reportedly detailed a specific vulnerability: the failure of the Wolferton pumping station, whether from long-term mechanical breakdown or a disruption in power supply, could directly threaten nearby properties with flooding. The same document noted that if flooding conditions did emerge, temporary pumping equipment would need to be deployed as an emergency response. Let that sit for a moment. Andrew's safety from flooding, at his new home, apparently depends in part on a pumping station that could fail, and on emergency intervention if it does. The timing made this even more striking. Storm Chandra swept through Britain with heavy winds and rain right as this reporting emerged. King Charles reportedly had to close the children's play area at Sandringham due to unsafe conditions. Royal watchers noted that the storm illustrated, in real time, exactly the kind of weather event that could put Marsh Farm at genuine risk. Naturally, questions followed. Had the environmental risks been properly weighed before Marsh Farm was chosen? Was the king aware of the flooding vulnerability at the time the decision was made? And if he was, why select this property over other available options on the Sandringham estate? This part of Norfolk has a long, documented history with flooding, tied to its low-lying position near the Wash and its network of drainage channels and pumping infrastructure built up over generations to keep the surrounding farmland usable. Local residents in the Wolferton and Sandringham area are generally well aware of this history. It's part of living in that landscape. What makes the situation notably different for Marsh Farm is that its new occupant isn't a long-time local farmer familiar with the area's quirks, but a man who spent over 2 decades living behind the protected, elevated grounds of Windsor Great Park, with none of that flood exposure to contend with. The adjustment isn't just about square footage or staffing. It's about an entirely different relationship with the land itself. One where weather reports and pumping station maintenance schedules suddenly matter in a way they simply never did at Royal Lodge. Some commentators went further, suggesting, and this remains speculation, not confirmed fact, that the choice of Marsh Farm, flood risk included, may have been at least partly intended to make Andrew's situation uncomfortable enough that he might eventually choose to leave the UK altogether. The environmental concerns weren't the only red flag. Security experts reportedly raised serious questions about how defensible Marsh Farm could actually be. Authorities took the unusual step of extending Sandringham's no-fly zone to cover Marsh Farm as well, blocking drone surveillance of the property. This move reportedly came after drones were spotted over Sandringham in March 2025, during Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to King Charles, a reminder that security threats to the royal family are not abstract. The legislation extending that no-fly zone to Marsh Farm was reportedly made on September 16, 2025, and came into force on September 22, weeks before Andrew's titles were formally stripped in the public announcement. That timing matters. It suggests that planning for Andrew's relocation was already underway well before the public ever heard about it. This wasn't a sudden, reactive decision. It appears to have been calculated well in advance. Officials reportedly stated that restricting flight activity around the property was necessary in the public interest, citing public safety and security. But experts questioned whether a rural, isolated farmhouse could ever be secured to the same standard as Royal Lodge, sitting as it did within the already protected boundaries of Windsor Great Park. A remote property 2 miles from the nearest secure royal residence makes rapid response to any incident considerably harder. Security experts who spoke to reporters about the situation reportedly drew comparisons to how other high-profile but non-working royals have been housed in the past, noting that isolated rural properties, however heavily fortified after the fact, rarely match the layered security infrastructure built into estates like Windsor Great Park over generations. Response times, sightline coverage, perimeter integrity. All of it has to be built essentially from scratch at a property that was, until recently, an unoccupied working farm. That's a very different starting point than a residence with over 2 centuries of established royal security protocol already in place. Sources also reportedly indicated that King Charles would be funding Andrew's accommodation and security privately, rather than through public funds, a significant, ongoing personal cost. There's a real irony buried in that detail. In some ways, it might have been financially simpler to let Andrew remain at Royal Lodge, where security infrastructure was already fully established, rather than build an entirely new security operation from scratch at a flood-prone farmhouse 2 miles from anywhere. Throughout all of this upheaval, one relationship had appeared unshakable: Andrew's bond with his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson. She had stood beside him through scandal after scandal, living at Royal Lodge since 2008 in what the two of them described as a close friendship that outlasted their marriage. She defended him publicly, long after others distanced themselves. But in January 2026, reports emerged suggesting Sarah would not be joining Andrew at Marsh Farm. According to one account, the two of them were required to move out by January the 25th, and while Sarah had stood by him for years, she was reportedly ready to spread her wings, choosing not to follow him to the new house on the Sandringham estate. Reports suggested she wasn't moving in with Beatrice in the Cotswolds either, but was instead making her own plans, closer to Windsor. If accurate, this marks the end of a genuinely unusual arrangement. Nearly 3 decades of closeness following their 1996 divorce, built on co-parenting and a loyalty that survived years of scandal, including the full weight of the Epstein Association. Even that loyalty, it seems, had its limits. Sarah's own public journey has been its own kind of rollercoaster. After the divorce, she spent years rebuilding her public image, moving through business ventures, charity work, and a slow, careful reputational recovery that many royal watchers considered genuinely successful. Choosing to remain close to Andrew, even living under the same roof for well over a decade after their marriage ended, was itself unusual enough to draw regular commentary, but it also became, over time, part of what made their story compelling to the public. Two people who couldn't make a marriage work, but who seemingly couldn't fully let go of each other either. Losing her title alongside him was, by many accounts, its own separate blow, not tied to any personal scandal of her own, but to her continued association with his. That distinction matters, and it may explain why, after standing by him through so much, she's reportedly chosen this particular moment to step back and build something of her own, separate from the fallout still surrounding her former husband. For Andrew, the reported loss of Sarah's presence lands as another serious blow. She had been his companion, his most consistent public defender, someone who understood the unique pressures of royal life from the inside. Without her at Marsh Farm, by most accounts, he faces a level of isolation he hasn't experienced in decades. And it raises a question worth sitting with. Did Sarah simply want independence after everything? Or did she see something in Andrew's long-term prospects that made her unwilling to tie her future to his any longer? We don't know. But the timing is hard to ignore. Let's take stock of exactly what's been lost here, because the scale of it is easy to underestimate. The private swimming pool, gone. The aviary he kept for years, gone. The sunken garden, cultivated over decades, gone. The Royal Chapel of All Saints, where he could worship away from public view, gone, meaning any future religious services will likely require travel, and possibly public exposure he's spent years trying to avoid. 6 lodge cottages that once housed staff and guests, gone. The gardener's cottage and dedicated police accommodation, gone. Live-in staff attending to his needs around the clock, replaced by ad hoc help arriving on someone else's schedule. Even something as simple as proper garaging for his vehicles, gone. But more than any single amenity, what Andrew appears to be losing is independence. Autonomy. Dignity, in the fullest sense of the word. Friends reportedly say the reality of Marsh Farm hit him hard. That phrase, "he really didn't want Marsh Farm," capturing the depth of his reluctance. But with a formal eviction notice in hand, reluctance wasn't going to change the outcome. Royal experts have suggested that King Charles's choice of Marsh Farm sends a message far beyond Andrew himself, a signal to the rest of the family and the wider public that titles and privilege come bound to expectations of behavior, and that failing to meet those expectations brings consequences that are swift, severe, and lasting. Increasingly, royal commentators have framed Marsh Farm not just as a smaller house, but as a deliberate strategy, geographic distance functioning as a form of control. Placing Andrew 2 miles from Sandringham House, rather than closer at Wood Farm, wasn't framed as a matter of convenience. It reportedly reflected a calculated decision about how much distance was necessary to keep him at arm's length from the rest of the family during moments like Christmas gatherings, while still keeping him within reach. That isolation isn't just physical. Royal Lodge sat in Windsor, where Andrew had built 2 decades of local connections and familiarity. Marsh Farm sits in a rural pocket of Norfolk where he has essentially no established relationships. At 65 or 66, by most accounts, he's starting over socially and doing it far from his daughters, both of whom maintain residences in or around London and have reportedly been important sources of support for him. Consider what a typical week might look like for Andrew going forward, based on what's been reported. No royal engagements to structure his calendar, since those ended back in 2019. No steady stream of visitors dropping by a well-known Windsor address, since Marsh Farm's location and heightened security make casual visits considerably harder to arrange. No live-in staff providing the kind of daily social contact that comes naturally with a fully staffed household. Whatever social world Andrew maintained around Royal Lodge for over 2 decades doesn't simply transplant itself to a farmhouse 2 miles outside Sandringham. It has to be rebuilt, largely from nothing, at a stage of life when building new social connections tends to get considerably harder for anyone, royal or otherwise. According to some reports, Andrew is well aware of this isolation strategy, aware enough that friends have suggested he might ultimately choose to leave the United Kingdom altogether. One friend was quoted suggesting he could relocate to the Middle East, where he's maintained long-standing business relationships, including reported ties in Dubai and the UAE, are places where, some have speculated, his past might not follow him quite as relentlessly as it does at home. It's important to stress, this is speculation being discussed by commentators, not a confirmed plan. But it's being taken seriously enough by royal watchers that it's worth understanding as a real possibility on the table. And then, in mid-January 2026, came a twist that reframed the entire situation. Reports suggested Marsh Farm might not even be Andrew's permanent home, that it could be temporary or interim accommodation while something else was arranged behind the scenes. Sit with that for a second. After the renovations, the security fencing, the CCTV, the months of construction, Marsh Farm might just be a stopgap. According to some sources, Andrew could be offered temporary accommodation on the Sandringham estate while further renovation work continues, either on Marsh Farm itself or on some other property entirely. The exact plan, if one exists, hasn't been made clear publicly. What this means, practically, is that Andrew's housing situation may be far from settled. More moves. More uncertainty. Being shifted from one temporary arrangement to another is its own particular kind of instability, and after everything else, it's not hard to imagine how unsettling that would be. Some observers have interpreted the temporary label as evidence that King Charles hasn't yet finalized a long-term plan for how to handle his brother. It's a fair point. The scale of investment in Marsh Farm security and infrastructure doesn't obviously line up with a purely short-term stay. Others have suggested that temporary framing serves a different purpose entirely, a face-saving way to let Andrew accept the move without having to fully surrender hope that his circumstances might eventually improve, allowing the King's team to present the farmhouse as a reasonable interim step rather than his permanent fate. Either way, describing Marsh Farm as temporary keeps options open for adjustments if Andrew's health changes, if security threats escalate, if the flood risk becomes an active problem rather than a theoretical one, or if public opinion shifts in some direction nobody currently expects. So what does all of this actually add up to? It's not really about flooding, or a lack of garage space, or 2 miles of rural isolation. It's about the fact that Andrew's entire existence has become defined by uncertainty. He went from being a prince with a secure home and a defined place in the world, to being a man whose housing is temporary, whose titles are gone, whose future is unclear, and whose place in the United Kingdom itself may, in the eyes of some commentators, be an open question. Marsh Farm isn't just a smaller house. For many watching this unfold, it's become a symbol of a status that's been fundamentally diminished, and one that could still shift again with very little warning. 30 rooms to a farmhouse. Peppercorn rent to full dependence on his brother's arrangements. Royal duties to exile. Prince Andrew to simply Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. That's the transformation this story has tracked, step by step. Which brings us to the real question, the one this entire video has been building toward. What does Andrew do next? Because that decision, more than anything that's already happened, is what could genuinely shake the monarchy going forward. Does he accept the exile quietly, settling into life at Marsh Farm and gradually fading from public relevance? That's the outcome King Charles is reportedly hoping for, or a slow fade, no further headlines, no further damage. It's also, according to those who know Andrew, the outcome friends consider least likely, given his history of resisting pressure rather than yielding to it. Does he fight back through legal channels, forcing a public confrontation that keeps dragging the Crown's name through fresh headlines? Legal experts have noted that while the lease has been formally surrendered, questions around compensation, property rights, and the process by which titles were removed could, in theory, still be contested, a prospect that would guarantee months, possibly years, of continued scrutiny. Does he go further still? Interviews, a memoir, revelations that could shake the royal family in ways far more damaging than anything that's happened so far. A disgraced royal with nothing left to protect has, historically, proven to be one of the most unpredictable forces an institution like this can face. The mere possibility of a tell-all account, whether it materializes or not, is enough to keep palace advisors working overtime. Or does he leave the country entirely, placing himself beyond the family's ability to manage or contain him? Given his reported business ties abroad, this remains, according to commentators, a live possibility. One that would remove him from constant British media scrutiny, but would also mean surrendering whatever remaining connection he has to the country and the family he was born into. King Charles has taken a genuinely unprecedented step against his own brother. But the honest question, the one nobody in the palace can fully answer yet, is whether that step actually solves the problem, or simply delays a much bigger one. Because a man who has lost his titles, his home, his companion of nearly 30 years, and very possibly his sense of who he is, a man with very little left to lose, is, by most accounts, exactly the kind of person capable of doing something nobody saw coming. There's a broader lesson in this story too, one that extends beyond Andrew himself. Every modern monarchy operates on a kind of unspoken contract with the public it serves. Privilege in exchange for service, prestige in exchange for restraint. When that contract breaks down, when privilege continues without the service that's supposed to justify it, the pressure doesn't just disappear. It builds, quietly, until something forces it into the open. That's arguably what happened here. Not a single scandal, but years of accumulated tension between what the public expected and what the institution had allowed to continue unchecked. And that raises a question worth considering for the monarchy as a whole, not just for Andrew. If a king is willing to strip his own brother of his home, his titles, and his standing, what does that signal for anyone else within the family who might, someday, find themselves out of step with what the public and the crown are willing to tolerate? Some royal historians have suggested this moment could be remembered less as a story about one disgraced prince and more as a turning point in how the modern monarchy manages accountability within its own ranks. For now, though, the story remains centered on one man, in one farmhouse, on a floodplain 2 miles from the family he was born into. Whatever he decides to do next, the ripple effects won't stay contained to him alone. It's easy, watching a story like this unfold, to focus purely on the spectacle, the mansion, the titles, the security details, the sheer scale of what's been lost. But underneath all of that is a much simpler, more human question that applies well beyond royal circles. What happens to a person when the identity they've built their entire life around is suddenly taken away? Andrew spent decades as a prince, a duke, a working member of one of the most recognizable families on earth. That identity shaped everything, where he lived, how he was treated, what doors opened for him without question. Now, at an age when most people are settling into the life they've built, he's being asked to construct an entirely new one, with far fewer resources, far less support, and none of the status that used to smooth every interaction. Whether you see this as justice finally catching up with him, or as an excessively harsh outcome for a man who's already lost so much publicly, the human dimension of this story is hard to ignore. King Charles didn't just strip a title. He fundamentally altered the trajectory of his brother's remaining years, and by extension, reshaped how the monarchy itself will likely be judged, for better or worse, on how it handled one of its own. So here's what I want to know from you. Out of everything in this story, the flood risk at Marsh Farm, the hoarding discovery inside Royal Lodge, Sarah Ferguson choosing not to follow him, or the possibility that even Marsh Farm is only temporary, which detail shocked you the most? Do you think King Charles handled this the right way, or should this have been done differently? And most importantly, what do you think Andrew actually does next? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story is still unfolding in real time, and your perspective genuinely adds to the conversation. If this kept you hooked all the way to the end, do me a favor and hit like, share it with someone who'd find this as fascinating as you just did, and subscribe so you're here for the next update. Because if there's one thing this story has proven, it's that the crown has never faced a situation quite like this one, and how it ends could reshape the monarchy for years to come.